They told me my husband was dead. They lied. For 65 years, I believed the lie that shattered my world, buried my dreams, and turned me into a woman I never wanted to become. But 3 days ago, I discovered the truth that will haunt me until my dying breath. And now I'm sitting here, my hands trembling so violently I can barely hold this microphone. Because if I don't speak now, I'll take this devastating secret to my grave. And 3 more lives will remain destroyed by a truth that should have been told decades ago. But before I tell you what I discovered, before I reveal the secret that will change everything you think you know about love, betrayal, and the lies we tell ourselves to survive, I need you to understand something. This story doesn't end where you think it will. What I thought was the complete truth 3 days ago was only the beginning of a revelation so shocking, so completely devastating, that I'm still not sure I have the strength to survive it. My name is Eleanor Rose Patterson Morrison. I'm 87 years old, and what I'm about to confess will not just shake you to your core. It will make you question everything you believe about the people you love, the secrets they keep, and the lengths they'll go to protect you from truths that could destroy you. This isn't just my story. It's the story of how one lie can create a cascade of deception that spans generations, how love can become the most dangerous weapon of all, and how sometimes the people who hurt us most are the ones trying desperately to save us. Listen carefully, because every word I'm about to say is true, even though I've spent 3 sleepless nights praying it wasn't. Even though I've stared at documents, photographs, and evidence that turned my entire life into a lie. Even though I now know that everything, absolutely everything, I believed about my life was carefully constructed fiction, designed to protect me from a truth so horrible that those who loved me thought death would be kinder. They were wrong. Part 1. The perfect lie. It was December 7th, 1958. Pearl Harbor Day, 17 years after the attack that changed America forever. I was 22 years old, married to the most wonderful man who ever walked this earth, James Patterson. We'd been married exactly 11 months and 6 days. I counted every single one of those precious days because I knew, somehow, that happiness this pure was too good to last. We were living in a tiny 2-room apartment above Miller's Bakery on South Grand Avenue in downtown Springfield, Illinois. The apartment was so small that when James stretched his arms, he could touch both walls of our bedroom. But it was ours. The rent was $38 a month, which was steep on James's Ford plant salary of $87 a week. But Mrs. Miller let me help in the bakery some mornings in exchange for fresh bread and the occasional apple pie that made James's eyes light up like a child's on Christmas morning. I was 3 months pregnant with our first child, and I had never been happier in my entire life. Every morning, I'd wake up before dawn to the smell of fresh bread rising from the bakery below, and I'd lie there with James's hand resting on my still small belly, listening to him whisper dreams to our baby. "This little one's going to change everything, Ellie," he'd say, his voice thick with sleep and hope. "We're going to give him everything we never had. A real home, with a yard and a swing set, and maybe a dog. What do you think, little one? Would you like a dog to grow up with?" I'd feel a flutter of movement, probably too early to be the baby, but I convinced myself it was our little miracle responding to his daddy's voice. James would press his ear to my belly and swear he could hear the baby's heartbeat, though the doctor had told us it was still too early for that. Those were the most perfect months of my life. James would come home from the Ford plant every evening at exactly 5:47 p.m. I knew because I'd watch the clock from 5:30 onward, counting the minutes until I'd hear his heavy work boots on the stairs. He'd burst through our door with grease, under his fingernails and the most beautiful smile in the world, always carrying some small surprise. A candy bar he'd bought from the vending machine at work, a flower he'd picked from someone's garden on his walk home, once even a tiny pair of yellow baby booties he'd seen in Woolworth's window. "Yellow because we don't know if it's a boy or girl yet," he'd said, holding them up proudly. but I have a feeling it's a boy. A son who's going to be everything his daddy couldn't be. James had grown up poor in Springfield, one of 6 children, in a house that was too small and too cold, with a father who drank away his paycheck and a mother who worked herself into an early grave trying to keep food on the table. He'd dropped out of high school at 16 to work and help support his younger siblings, and he carried that burden of lost education like a weight on his shoulders. "Our son is going to college, Ellie," he'd tell me as we lay in bed planning our future. "I don't care if I have to work 3 jobs. He's going to have every opportunity I never had. He's going to be a lawyer, or a doctor, or maybe an engineer. Something important, something that matters." I'd run my fingers through his dark hair and tell him he mattered, that providing for his family was the most important job in the world. But James had bigger dreams for our child than his own humble beginnings had allowed for him. That last morning, December 7th, 1958, started exactly like every other morning for the past 11 months. James woke up at 5:15 a.m., kissed my forehead while he thought I was still sleeping, and whispered to my belly, "Good morning, little one. Daddy's got to go to work now, but I'll be home tonight with stories to tell you." I made his coffee in our tiny kitchen while he shaved with the straight razor that had belonged to his grandfather, the only valuable thing his family had ever owned. I packed his lunch in the metal pail his brother Robert had given us as a wedding present. 2 thick sandwiches with ham I'd sliced myself, an apple from the batch Mrs. Miller let me take home, and a thermos of coffee with 2 sugars, just the way he liked it. At exactly 6:30 a.m., James kissed me goodbye at our front door. It was a longer kiss than usual, more tender, and when he pulled away, he looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, almost like he was memorizing my face. "I love you more than all the stars in the sky, Ellie Patterson," he said, using my new married name in that way that still made my heart flutter. "You and our baby are everything good in this world." "I love you too, James Patterson," I replied, straightening his collar and breathing in the scent of his aftershave. "Bring home milk on your way back. We're almost out." "Milk, bread if Mrs. Miller doesn't have extra, and maybe something sweet for dessert," he said, backing down the stairs but keeping his eyes on me. "You're eating for 2 now, remember?" Those were the last words my husband ever spoke to me, though I wouldn't know it for hours yet. I spent that morning exactly as I'd spent every morning for months, humming Christmas carols while I tidied our tiny apartment, addressing Christmas cards to James's family and the few friends we'd made as a young married couple, planning the menu for Christmas dinner that we'd host in our cramped living room. I remember every detail of that day with crystal clarity, the way you remember perfect moments just before they're destroyed forever. I wore my blue dress with the white collar, the one James said made my eyes look like summer sky. I was hand-stitching a small quilt for the baby, using scraps of fabric Mrs. Miller had given me from old flour sacks. My hands rested on my belly as I worked, feeling the tiny flutters that I was convinced were our baby saying hello. At 11:30 a.m., I walked to the grocery store to pick up ingredients for the beef stew I was planning to make for dinner, James's favorite meal, especially on cold December days. Mrs. Henderson from the apartment downstairs was there, and we talked about how expensive everything was getting, how hard it was for young families to make ends meet on factory wages. "You and that husband of yours are doing just fine," she said, patting my arm with her gloved hand. "That boy loves you something fierce. The way he looks at you when you walk down the street together, like you hung the moon and stars just for him." I blushed with pride because it was true. James did look at me like that, like I was the most precious thing in his world. Other wives complained that their husbands took them for granted, but James never had. Even 11 months into our marriage, he still brought me wildflowers, still told me I was beautiful when I woke up with messy hair, still held my hand when we walked to church on Sunday mornings. I spent the afternoon cooking, the rich smell of beef stew filling our tiny apartment, making it feel even more like the cozy home we'd created together. I set the table with our wedding china, only 4-place settings, But they were ours, a gift from James's Aunt Margaret, who'd believed in our love when others said we were too young to know what we wanted. At 4:15 p.m., there was a knock at my door. I was expecting Mrs. Miller, who sometimes came up to chat while her afternoon bread was rising, or maybe Mrs. Henderson asking to borrow sugar again. I opened the door with a smile, an offer of coffee already on my lips. Instead, I found James's brother Robert standing in my doorway, his face white as fresh snow, his hands shaking as he removed his hat. Robert was older than James by 3 years, married with 2 young children, and he'd always been the responsible one, the brother who looked out for everyone else. But now, he looked like he'd seen something that had shaken him to his very core. "Ellie," he said, and in that single word, I heard my world ending. Before he said another word, I knew. The way you know when lightning is about to strike, when a storm is about to break, when everything good in your life is about to be swept away. "There's been an accident at the plant," he continued, his voice breaking. "James, Ellie, he's gone." The floor disappeared beneath my feet. The walls started spinning, and I grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling. Our baby seemed to stop, moving inside me, as if he knew his daddy wasn't coming home, as if even at 3 months, he understood that our perfect little world had just been destroyed. "Gone where?" I whispered, because my mind couldn't accept what Robert was telling me. "What do you mean, gone?" Robert stepped inside, caught me as my knees buckled, helped me to the couch where James and I had spent countless evenings planning our future. "He's dead, Ellie. There was an explosion at the plant around 2:30 this afternoon. The boiler in Section C blew, and James was working right there. He and 2 other men. They didn't make it out. The baby seemed to kick then, hard, as if protesting this news, as if our unborn child knew that something fundamental had just broken in the universe. I doubled over, pain shooting through my belly, and for a terrifying moment, I thought I was losing the baby too, that God was taking everything from me in one horrible day. "The baby," I gasped, and Robert knelt beside me, his own tears falling now. "You're going to be okay, Ellie. The baby's going to be okay." But James, there wasn't enough left to. The explosion was so bad that he couldn't finish the sentence. But I understood. My husband, the man who'd kissed me goodbye that morning and promised to bring home milk, had been blown apart by industrial machinery. There wouldn't be a body to hold one last time, no peaceful face to kiss goodbye. Just emptiness where the love of my life used to be. I don't remember much about the next few hours. Robert called Dr. Morrison to check on the baby and make sure. The shock hadn't caused any complications. He called James's parents, his other siblings, his supervisor at the plant. I sat on our couch, staring at the table I'd set for dinner, at the pot of stew still simmering on the stove, at the Christmas cards I'd been addressing just hours before. The apartment filled with people, James's family, neighbors, friends from the plant who'd come to pay their respects. Everyone spoke in hushed tones, offering condolences I couldn't process, bringing food I couldn't eat, telling me how sorry they were for my loss. But none of it felt real. James was supposed to walk through that door at 5:47 p.m. with grease under his fingernails and a smile for his pregnant wife. He was supposed to taste the stew I'd made, tell me about his day, put his hands on my belly and talk to our baby about the world he was going to inherit. Instead, there was just silence where his voice should have been, emptiness where his presence should have filled our tiny home. The funeral was 3 days later, on a bitter December morning when the wind cut through Springfield like a knife and the ground was too frozen to dig easily. I stood beside a closed casket. They'd explained that there wasn't enough of James left for an open viewing, wearing the black dress he'd bought me for our 6-month anniversary, feeling our baby move inside me while they lowered my husband into the frozen earth. "Ashes to ashes, dust to dust," the minister said. But all I could think was that James wasn't ashes or dust. He was supposed to be home making silly faces at my belly, Supposed to be saving money for our baby's college education. Supposed to be growing old beside me in a house with a white picket fence and a yard big enough for children to play. I don't remember throwing dirt on his casket, but there's a photograph of me doing it. My face blank with shock, one hand on my pregnant belly, the other holding a handful of frozen earth. Robert took the picture, he told me later, because he thought someday I'd want to remember that I'd said goodbye. He was wrong. I never wanted to remember any of it. The months that followed James's death were a blur of survival instincts and desperate determination. James's life insurance policy paid out exactly $1,247, enough to cover the funeral costs and rent for 2 months, nothing more. The Ford plant offered their condolences and a collection they'd taken up among the workers. $73 and a sympathy card signed by men whose names I didn't recognize, but who'd worked alongside my husband in those last weeks of his life. I had to move, out of our apartment above the bakery. Mrs. Miller was kind about it, let me stay an extra week without paying rent, but she needed the space for a tenant who could afford the monthly payments. I packed James's clothes in paper bags, donated them to the church, kept only his watch and his grandfather's straight razor for our son to have someday. Robert and his wife Margaret tried to help, but they had their own 2 children to feed, and Robert's salary at the grain elevator barely covered their own expenses. James's parents blamed me for their son's death. If I hadn't gotten pregnant so quickly, they said, maybe James wouldn't have been working extra shifts to save money. Maybe he wouldn't have been in the plant that day. I was completely alone, carrying my dead husband's child with no family of my own to turn to. My parents had died in a car accident when I was 19, which was how I'd met James in the first place. He'd been working as a pallbearer at the funeral home, had helped carry my mother's casket, had stayed after the service to make sure I had a way home. I found a room in Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house on the rough side of Springfield. $8 a week for a space barely big enough for a single bed and a dresser. The bathroom was down the hall, shared with 5 other tenants, and the walls were so thin I could hear every conversation, every argument, every private moment of the people living around me. I got a job at Kowalski's alterations shop, working 6 days a week hemming dresses and taking in waistbands for the wealthy women of Springfield. My fingers bled from needle pricks, my back ached from hunching over the sewing machine, and the smell of fabric dye made my morning sickness even worse. But I made $12 a week, enough to pay for my room and buy food, enough to survive, until the baby came. Every night, I'd return to my tiny room, exhausted and heartbroken, and I'd talk to the baby growing inside me. I'd tell him stories about his daddy, about the man who'd loved us both so much that he'd worked himself to death trying to provide for us. I'd describe the house we'd planned to buy, the college fund James had wanted to start, the dreams that had died with him in that December explosion. Your daddy was the best man who ever lived, I'd whisper to my belly in the darkness. He loved you before he even met you. He used to put his hands right here and tell you about all the adventures you'd have together, all the things he was going to teach you. The baby would kick in response, and I'd pretend it was James somehow communicating with us, letting us know he was still watching over his family from wherever good men go when their time on earth is cut too short. I was 7 months pregnant when I collapsed at work. The doctor Mrs. Kowalski called said I was malnourished, anemic, and working too hard for a woman in my condition. But what choice did I have? Stop working and starve, or keep working and risk losing the only piece of James I had left? Mrs. Kowalski, let me work shorter hours, and the church ladies brought me soup and bread when they could. But charity only goes so far, and I was too proud to accept more help than I absolutely needed to survive. Our son was born on May 15, 1959, after 18 hours of labor in Springfield General Hospital. I had no husband to pace the waiting room, no family to celebrate with, just a tired doctor and 2 nuns who assisted with births for women who couldn't afford private care. But when they placed that baby in my arms, when I saw his perfect little face that was so much like James's, it took my breath away. I knew I could survive anything. David James Patterson weighed 6 pounds, 3 ounces, had dark hair like his daddy and the same stubborn chin, and when he opened his eyes and looked at me, I swear I saw James looking back. "Hello, little miracle," I whispered, tears streaming down my cheeks. "I'm your mama, and I'm going to love you enough for both parents. Your daddy wanted to be here so badly, but he had to go to heaven before you were ready to come out and meet the world." David latched onto nursing immediately, as if he knew I was all he had, as if he understood that we were a team now, the two of us against whatever the world might throw at us. Raising a baby alone in 1959 wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. Single mothers were looked down upon, whispered about behind their backs, treated like failures even when they were widows who'd done nothing wrong except love men who died too young. I worked 3 jobs to keep us alive, cleaning houses before dawn while David slept in a basket beside whatever bed I was making, working at the alteration shop during the day while Mrs. Kowalski watched him in a crib she'd set up in the back room, and taking in mending at night while David nursed and dozed in my lap. I was exhausted, heartbroken, but I was surviving. David was healthy, happy, beginning to smile and laugh and reach for things. Sometimes, when he looked at me with those eyes so much like James's, I could almost believe my husband was still with us somehow, living on in the child we'd created together. When David was 6 months old, I met William Morrison. I was at the post office, mailing a birthday card to James's mother, who still blamed me for her son's death but softened slightly when I sent pictures of her grandson. When David started crying, he was teething, fussy, and nothing I did seemed to comfort him. "Sometimes they just need to cry it out," a gentle voice said behind me, and I turned to see a tall man with kind eyes and prematurely gray hair, holding the hand of a little girl about 3 years old. "I'm sorry," I said, bouncing David and trying to soothe him. "He's usually not like this in public." "No need to apologize," the man said. "I'm William Morrison. This is my daughter, Emma, and you look like you could use a friend who understands how hard it is to manage alone." That was how I learned that William was a widower, that he'd lost his wife Catherine in childbirth 2 years earlier, that he was raising Emma by himself while working as a loan officer at First National Bank. We struck up a conversation about how difficult single parenthood was, how the world seemed designed for couples, not for people trying to raise children alone. "Would you like to have coffee sometime?" he asked as we left the post office. "Emma loves playing with other children, and it might be nice for both of us to have adult conversation with someone who understands what we're going through." I almost said no. It felt like a betrayal of James's memory, like I was giving up on the love we'd shared. But David needed more than I could give him alone, and I was so tired, so lonely, so desperate for someone to talk to who wouldn't judge me for being young and widowed and struggling to survive. We started meeting at the park on Sunday afternoons after church. William would bring Emma, I'd bring David, and we'd watch them play while sharing coffee from a thermos and talking about our lost spouses, our fears for our children, our hopes for the future. William was nothing like James, where James had been. Passionate, impulsive, full of dreams and grand plans, William was steady, practical, thoughtful. He'd finished high school, had some college, spoke carefully, and thought before acting. He didn't make my heart race the way James had, but he made me feel safe in a way I hadn't felt since that December morning when my world fell apart. "I loved Catherine very much," he told me one afternoon while Emma pushed David on the swing set. "But she's gone, and Emma needs a mother. You need help raising David, and I need someone who understands what it's like to love someone you've lost." It wasn't romantic love he was offering, and I wasn't looking for passion. What we were both looking for was partnership, companionship, the practical benefits of two people pooling their resources to raise their children better than either could alone. "I'll never stop loving James," I told him honestly. "He was the love of my life, the father of my child, and no one will ever, Replace him." "I wouldn't want to replace him," William replied. "But David deserves a father figure, Emma deserves a mother, and we deserve to have help raising them. Love isn't always about passion, Eleanor. Sometimes it's about commitment, about choosing to build something good together." We married on October 15th, 1960, in a small ceremony at City Hall. I wore a simple blue dress and carried a small bouquet of white roses. David, now 17 months old and walking, held onto my skirt during the ceremony, while Emma stood beside William in a pink dress that made her look like a little princess. It wasn't the wedding I'd dreamed of as a young girl. That wedding had been to James in Springfield's First Methodist Church, with a white dress and a reception in the church basement, and all our friends and family celebrating our love. This wedding was about survival, about creating stability for our children, about two broken people deciding to help each other heal. William legally adopted David, gave him his name. David Morrison, no longer carrying his birth father's surname, though I kept James's memory alive in bedtime stories, in the photograph I kept on David's dresser, in the way I'd whisper about his first daddy when William was at work and couldn't hear me, keeping those memories alive. We moved into William's house on Maple Street, a real home with 3 bedrooms, a kitchen big enough for a family, and a backyard where David could play safely. For the first time since James's death, I had enough food to eat, enough heat in winter, enough security to sleep through the night without worrying about how I'd pay next month's rent. William was a good husband, patient with my occasional tears. For James, understanding when I needed to talk about the life I'd lost. He never tried to replace James in my heart, never demanded that I love him the way I'd loved my first husband. He just asked that I be a good partner, a good mother to Emma, and that I help him create a stable home for all of us. But I need to stop here and tell you something crucial. Something I didn't know then, but discovered 3 days ago. Every single thing I just told you was built on a lie so massive, so carefully constructed, so completely devastating that it would take me 48 more years to learn the truth, because James Patterson didn't die in that explosion on December 7th, 1958. He was very much alive, and what he did to me, what they all did to me, was so much worse than death. We had 2 more children together, William and I. Sarah was born in 1962, a sweet-tempered baby with William's steady disposition and my stubborn streak. Michael followed in 1964, quiet and thoughtful, with an old soul that seemed to understand more than a child should. Life settled into comfortable routines. William worked at the bank, eventually becoming a loan officer, then assistant manager, providing the kind of steady income that James's factory work never could have offered. I kept house, raised the children, volunteered at their schools, became the kind of suburban wife and mother that 1960s America expected women to be. But even in those peaceful years, even surrounded by the security William provided, I carried James with me like a sacred flame. I told David stories about his birth father every night, described the man who'd loved him before he was born, who'd worked so hard to provide for us that he'd literally worked himself to death. "Your first daddy was the most wonderful man who ever lived," I'd tell him as I tucked him into bed in the house William had bought for us. "He loved you so much that even though he never got to hold you, he made sure you'd be provided for. That's why he was working so hard, why he was at the plant that day." David would ask endless questions about James. What did he look like? What was his favorite food? Did he like baseball? Would he have taught David to drive a car? I answered every question with love and pride, painting a picture of a heroic father who died too young, but who would have moved mountains for his son. As David grew older, he became fascinated with James's story. He kept the photograph I'd given him on his dresser, wrote school reports about his real father, who'd died in an industrial accident, asked William detailed questions about factory, safety, and whether such accidents could be prevented. William handled it all with patience and grace, never showing jealousy when David talked about the father who'd preceded him, never making me feel guilty for keeping James's memory alive. He understood that some loves are too deep to bury, too precious to forget, and he never asked me to choose between honoring my first husband and loving my second. By 1975, we looked like the perfect American family. William had been promoted. To bank manager, we'd paid off the mortgage on our house on Maple Street, and we had the white picket fence and rose garden that James had dreamed of providing for me. David was 16, captain of his high school baseball team, planning to study engineering at the University of Illinois. Sarah was 13, all legs and giggles, dreaming of becoming a teacher like Miss Henderson, her favorite elementary school teacher. Michael was 11, quiet like William, but with a gentle heart that drew people to him. We attended Springfield Methodist Church every Sunday, hosted barbecues in our backyard during the summer, took family vacations to Wisconsin lakes where the children could swim and fish, and William could forget about interest rates and loan applications for a few precious days. I had learned to be content, if not entirely happy. I loved William in a steady, comfortable way that was different from the passionate love I'd shared with James, but no less valuable. He was a good man who'd saved my life and David's life when we needed saving most, and I was grateful for the security and stability he'd provided. But sometimes, late at night when William was sleeping beside me and the children were safe in their beds, I'd think about James. I'd wonder what our life would have been like if he'd lived, whether we would have been able to give David the advantages that William's steady income had provided, whether the passionate love we'd shared would have settled into something as comfortable as what I had with William. I kept James's memory alive, not just for David, but for myself. I needed to believe that somewhere in heaven, my first husband was watching over our son, proud of the young man David was becoming, grateful that I'd found someone who could provide the stability James's dangerous job never could have offered. That beautiful, carefully constructed life came crashing down on a Tuesday evening in March 1975. I was washing dishes while William read the Springfield State Journal Register, the children doing homework around the kitchen table, when there was a knock at our door. David jumped up to answer it before I could stop him. He was 16, eager to take on adult responsibilities, always the first to help when someone needed something. I heard voices from the front hall. David's excited, "Mom, you need to come here right now," and my stomach dropped with the same terrible intuition I'd felt 17 years earlier when Robert came to tell me James was dead. I walked to the front door, drying my hands on my apron, and found David standing beside a man I didn't recognize. A middle-aged man with graying hair and tired eyes, wearing a rumpled suit and holding a manila folder that looked far too official for a social call. "Mrs. Morrison?" he said, and I noticed he didn't use my first name, didn't smile the way most visitors would. "I'm Detective Frank Sullivan with the Springfield Police Department. I need to speak with you about your first husband, James Patterson." The dish towel fell from my hands. William appeared behind me, drawn by the formal tone in the detective's voice, the children clustering around us because they could sense that something momentous was happening in our quiet suburban home. "What about James?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. "He died in 1958. Detective Sullivan's face was grave as he looked from me to William, to the children who were old enough to understand that their family's history was about to be rewritten. "Ma'am, that's what we need to talk about. May I come in?" We sat around our kitchen table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of family meals, where the children had done homework and I'd planned grocery lists, and William had balanced our checkbook, and Detective Sullivan opened his folder to reveal photographs, documents, and reports that made absolutely no sense to me. "Mrs. Morrison," he began, and his voice was gentle but firm, "I'm investigating a case involving insurance fraud that goes back to 1958. Your first husband's name came up in our files, and what we've discovered is complicated." William reached for my hand, sensing that whatever was coming was going to shatter the peaceful life we'd built together. David leaned forward in his chair, his young face intense with the kind of attention he usually reserved for baseball or his engineering books. According to our investigation, Detective Sullivan continued, James Patterson didn't die in that plant explosion in December 1958. The world stopped. Literally stopped. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't process the words he was saying. The kitchen where I'd cooked thousands of meals suddenly felt like it was tilting, like the laws of physics had suddenly stopped applying to my life. That's impossible, I managed to say. I was at his funeral. I buried him. There was a closed casket because the explosion was so bad that they couldn't. Ma'am, you buried someone else. The explosion did happen. 3 men did die that day. But James Patterson wasn't one of them. David shot to his feet so quickly that his chair toppled backward, clattering against the kitchen floor. You're lying, he said, his 16-year-old voice cracking with emotion. My dad died before I was born. My mom wouldn't lie about something like that. Son, Detective Sullivan said gently, your mother didn't lie. She believed what she was told. But the people who told her were part of an elaborate insurance fraud scheme. According to our records, James Patterson left Springfield 3 days before the explosion, took a Greyhound bus to Chicago with a woman named Patricia Henley, who worked as a secretary in the plant's front office. I thought I was going to vomit. The room was spinning, and I gripped William's hand so tightly that I must have been hurting him, but he didn't complain. This couldn't be true. James had loved me, had been excited about our baby, had kissed me goodbye that morning with such tenderness, such promise. You're wrong, I said, my voice rising. James would never leave me, especially not when I was pregnant. He loved our baby. He loved me. He wouldn't abandon us. Detective Sullivan pulled out more papers, official documents with seals and signatures, police reports from Chicago, records that painted a picture I couldn't accept. Mrs. Morrison, James Patterson has been living in Chicago under the assumed name James Henry for the past 17 years. He married Patricia Henley in 1959, has 3 children with her. He owns an auto repair shop on the South Side, pays taxes, votes, lives a completely normal life under his new identity. The baby kicked. For one impossible moment, I thought I felt our unborn child kicking inside me, the way David had moved when I was pregnant 17 years ago, as if he knew his father was abandoning us. But that was just my mind breaking, just the stress making me remember things that couldn't possibly be happening now. Sarah started crying. Michael moved closer to William, who was staring at Detective Sullivan with the kind of shock that comes when your entire understanding of reality shifts in a single moment. Is he still alive? I asked, and my voice sounded like it was coming from someone else, someone far away. My James, is he still alive right now? Yes, ma'am. Very much alive. And that's when I fainted. That's when 17 years of grief, of carefully constructed memories, of bedtime stories about David's heroic father, came crashing down in our kitchen while my family watched their mother completely fall apart. But here's what I need you to understand. Everything I just told you was only the beginning. What I thought was the complete devastating truth that night in March 1975 was actually just the first crack in a wall of lies so massive, so carefully constructed, that it would take me another 48 years to discover what really happened. And when I finally learned the whole truth 3 days ago, it didn't just destroy what was left of my faith in love. It made me question everything I thought I knew about the people who claimed to love me, protect me, and keep me safe. I woke up on the kitchen floor with William holding my head, the children crying around me, and Detective Sullivan kneeling beside me with a glass of water. When the room stopped spinning, when I could focus on his face without everything tilting sideways, I asked the only question that mattered in that moment. I want to see him. I want to see James and ask him why he did this to us. William squeezed my hand. "Eleanor, you don't have to put yourself through that. We can handle this through lawyers, through the police. You don't need to face him." But I did need to face him. I needed to look into the eyes of the man I'd mourned for 17 years and ask him how he could have let me believe he was dead while I struggled to raise our child alone. I needed to understand how the person I'd loved more than life itself had been capable of such complete and devastating betrayal. Detective Sullivan explained that it would take time to arrange. James would have to be contacted, convinced to meet with me, convinced that cooperation was better than forcing the police to arrest him for fraud and abandonment. There were legal complications, statute of limitations issues, questions about what charges could actually be filed after so many years. "But Mrs. Morrison," he said as he prepared to leave that night, "you should know that this case is bigger than just your husband's disappearance. We're investigating a network of people who staged deaths for insurance money. James Patterson wasn't the only man who died and started over with a new identity. That information should have made me feel less alone, less like I'd been uniquely foolish to trust someone who'd betrayed me so completely. Instead, it made everything worse. It meant James hadn't disappeared in a moment of panic or fear. He'd been part of an organized criminal conspiracy, a planned deception that had required months of preparation and multiple accomplices. The next 2 weeks were torture. David refused to speak to anyone, refused to eat, spent his days staring at the photograph of James he'd kept on his dresser for 16 years. Sarah and Michael were confused, frightened by the chaos that had suddenly exploded in their ordered home. William tried to hold everything together, but I could see the shock in his eyes. The realization that the woman he'd married had been living a lie. Even she didn't know she was telling. "Did you ever suspect?" he asked me one night as we lay in bed, both of us staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. "Did James ever say anything, do anything, that made you wonder if something wasn't right?" I thought back to those last days, trying to remember warning signs I might have missed. Had James been acting differently? Had there been phone calls, mysterious absences, changes in his behavior that should have told me he was planning to abandon his pregnant wife and disappear forever? "He was working more overtime," I said finally. "The last month, he was staying late at the plant 3 or 4 nights a week. He said he was trying to save money for the baby, for the house we wanted to buy. But maybe he was planning his escape," William finished. "Maybe those late nights weren't at the plant at all." The thought made me sick. Every extra hour James had claimed to be working, I'd been home alone, pregnant, and proud of my husband's dedication to providing for our family. Instead, he might have been with Patricia Henley, planning how to fake his death and start over without the burden of a wife and child he no longer wanted. Detective Sullivan called on a Thursday afternoon to tell me James had agreed to meet. He would drive down from Chicago the following Saturday, meet me at a restaurant called Murphy's on the outskirts of Springfield, talk to me for as long as I needed to understand what had happened. "He's nervous about it," Detective Sullivan told me. "His lawyer advised him not to meet with you at all, but he says he owes you an explanation. He wants you to know he never meant for things to happen the way they did. Never meant for things to happen the way they did." As if 17 years of believing he was dead, 17 years of struggling to raise his son alone, 17 years of guilt and grief and carefully preserved memories were just an unfortunate accident. Something that had happened to me rather than something he had done to me. William offered to come with me, but I knew this was something I had to do alone. This was my past, my pain, my need for answers that no one else could get for me. David begged to come, wanted to confront the father who'd abandoned him before he was born, but I couldn't let a 16-year-old boy face that kind of betrayal without understanding it myself first. I drove to Murphy's restaurant at exactly 2 p.m. on Saturday, March 29, 1975, wearing the same blue dress I'd worn the day James disappeared, though it was looser now after bearing 3 children and 17 years of William's steady love and home cooking. James was already there when I arrived, sitting in a corner booth with his back to the wall, looking older than his 39 years, worn down by whatever guilt he'd been carrying. When I walked through the door, when our eyes met for the first time in 17 years, the coffee cup fell from his hands and shattered on the floor of Murphy's restaurant. "Ellie," he whispered, and in that single word, I heard 17 years of secrets, fear, and something that might have been regret. He looked like David. That was the first thing that struck me. How much our son resembled this man who'd abandoned him. How the stubborn chin and dark eyes that I'd treasured in my child were reflections of the father who'd chosen to disappear rather than stay and raise the boy who carried his features. "Hello, James," I said, sliding into the booth across from him, surprised by how steady my voice sounded when everything inside me was screaming. "You look good for a dead man." He flinched at that, had the grace to look ashamed. A waitress came over to clean up the broken coffee cup, refill his mug, take my order. I asked for coffee I knew I wouldn't drink, just to give my hand something to hold, something to focus on besides the face of the man who'd destroyed my life and then built a new one without me. "You want to know why," he said when the waitress left us alone. "I want to know everything. I want to know how long you planned it, who helped you, whether you ever loved me at all, or if I was just some naive girl you amused yourself with until something better came along." James put his head in his hands, and when he looked up, there were tears in his eyes. Real tears. Or at least they looked real. "I loved you more than I knew how to handle, Ellie. I loved you so much it scared me to death. So you decided to scare me to death instead. You decided to let me think you'd been blown apart by industrial machinery while you started over with someone else? It wasn't supposed to happen like that. The original plan was just to disappear, leave town, send you divorce papers from somewhere far away. But when the explosion happened, when 3 men really did die, Patricia said it was the perfect opportunity to start completely clean. No legal complications, no alimony, no child support obligations. Patricia. The woman he'd chosen over me, the woman whose name I'd heard for the first time 2 weeks ago, but who'd apparently been part of my husband's life for months before he disappeared. "Tell me about her," I said. "Tell me about the woman who was worth abandoning your pregnant wife for." James looked uncomfortable, guilty, but he answered. "She worked in the front office at the plant, handled insurance claims and worker compensation cases. She knew about the fraud network, about how to fake deaths and collect on policies. When I told her I was feeling trapped, that I didn't know how to be a father, how to provide for a family on factory wages, she suggested we could start over somewhere else." "You felt trapped." I repeated the words slowly, tasting their bitterness. "By me? By our baby? By the responsibility. By the fear that I'd fail you both, that I'd end up like my father, drinking away my paycheck and disappointing everyone who counted on me. I was 22 years old, Ellie. I didn't know how to be a husband, let alone a father. When Patricia offered me a way out, a way to start fresh without the weight of expectations I couldn't meet. You took it," I finished. "You chose to abandon everything rather than try to grow into the man we needed." "I was a coward," he said, and at least he had the honesty to admit it. "I was young and scared and stupid, and I made the worst decision of my life. But I want you to know that leaving you nearly killed me. I've thought about you and our baby every single day for 17 years. Our baby has a name," I said, anger finally breaking through the numbness that had carried me through this conversation. "His name is David, and he's 16 years old, and he's been asking questions about his heroic father who died providing for his family. What am I supposed to tell him now? That his father was actually a criminal who abandoned him before he was born?" James winced as if I'd slapped him. "How is he? What kind of boy did he become?" "He became the kind of man you should have been," I said. "Responsible, loyal, someone who keeps his promises and faces his problems instead of running from them. He became everything you couldn't be, despite having your abandonment as his legacy. I want to meet him, James said. I want to try to explain, to make amends somehow. You gave up that right when you chose Patricia Henley over your unborn son. David has a father, William Morrison, the man who adopted him and raised him and showed him what real commitment looks like. You're just the stranger who provided the genetic material. James was crying openly now, but I felt no sympathy for him. 17 years too late for tears. 17 years too late for regret. What's your life like now? I asked. In Chicago, with Patricia and your other children. He told me about his auto repair shop, about the 3 children he'd raised. 2 boys and a girl, ages 15, 13, and 10. He told me about the house they'd bought in a working-class neighborhood, about little league games and school plays and family vacations to Wisconsin lakes. It was the life he could have had with me and David, the life I'd dreamed about during those lonely nights in Mrs. Kowalski's boarding house. But he'd chosen to build it with someone else, to be the father to other children that he'd refused to be to his firstborn son. Are you happy? I asked, and I genuinely wanted to know. I was, he said. For a while, I convinced myself I'd made the right choice. Patricia was easier to be with than you were. She didn't expect as much, didn't challenge me to be better than I was. But as the years went on, as I watched my other children grow up, I kept wondering about David, about what kind of man he was becoming, whether he looked like me, whether he'd inherited any of my interests or talents. He plays baseball, I said. He's captain of his high school team, just like you were. He wants to study engineering in college. He asks me questions about you constantly. What you were like, what you dreamed about, whether you would have been proud of him. I would be proud of him, James said. From what you've told me, he sounds like an incredible young man. He is, despite you, not because of you. We sat in silence for a while, 2 people who'd once planned to spend their lives together, now separated by 17 years of lies and the unbridgeable chasm of his betrayal. Ellie? He said finally. Is there any chance you could forgive me? Any chance we could find a way past this? I looked across the table at this man I'd once loved, more than breathing, this stranger who wore James's face but had made choices my James never would have made. I forgave you years ago, James, I said. I had to, or the anger would have poisoned me and David both. But forgiveness doesn't mean I can forget what you did. It doesn't mean David will ever get back the father he needed. It doesn't mean the 17 years I spent mourning you weren't stolen from my life. I know I can't undo what I did. But maybe I could try to make it right somehow. Maybe I could meet David, help with his college expenses, try to be some kind of father to him. Now, David doesn't need your money, I said. William and I have saved for his college education. David doesn't need a father. He has one, a real one who chose to stay when staying got hard. What David needs is for you to stay away from him until he's old enough to decide for himself whether he wants a relationship with the man who abandoned him. James nodded, accepting the boundary I was setting. What about you, Ellie? Did you find happiness with William? I found something better than happiness, I said. I found peace. I found a man who keeps his promises, who faces problems instead of running from them, who loves me enough to stay even when staying isn't easy. William gave me the life you were too scared to build with me. I'm glad, James said, and he sounded like he meant it. I'm glad you found someone who could be the husband you deserved. When I was ready to leave, when I'd heard enough to understand what had happened, but not so much that it would destroy the fragile peace I'd built with William and our children, I stood up from that booth in Murphy's restaurant and looked at James Patterson one last time. I need you to promise me something, I said. I need you to promise that you won't try to contact David until he's 18 and can make his own decisions about whether he wants to know you. I promise, he said, and I need you to promise that if the police decide to press charges, you'll accept whatever consequences come from what you did. You won't try to claim you were young and scared and didn't know better. I promise that too. I started to walk away, then turned back one final time. James, I need to ask you something, and I need you to tell me the absolute truth. That last morning, when you kissed me goodbye and said you loved me more than all the stars in the sky, did you mean it? Or were you already planning to disappear? He was quiet for so long I thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he said, I meant it. In that moment, I meant every word. I loved you completely, desperately, more than I'd ever loved anyone. But by that evening, when Patricia told me the plan was in motion, when she said we could start over without the weight of the past, I chose fear over love. I chose the easy path over the right one. Thank you for telling me the truth, I said. Finally. That was March 29th, 1975. I thought it was the end of the story, the final chapter in my first marriage, the last conversation I'd ever have with James Patterson. I was wrong. The drive back to Springfield gave me 2 hours to process what I'd learned, to begin figuring out how to rebuild my family's understanding of our history. William was waiting for me when I got home, sitting on our front porch in the late afternoon, sunlight, watching for my car with the kind of patient worry that had defined our entire marriage. "How are you?" he asked, pulling me into his arms before I'd even gotten out of the car. "Broken," I said honestly, "but not destroyed. There's a difference." We sat on our porch swing, the same swing where we'd watched our children play in the yard, where we'd planned family vacations and discussed school problems and celebrated report cards and birthdays. Now we were trying to figure out how to tell those children that everything they'd believed about their family history was a lie. "David's been in his room all day," William told me. "Won't eat, won't talk. Sarah keeps asking if we're getting divorced, if this means our family is falling apart. Michael's just quiet, but you know how he gets when he's worried." I knew. Michael had always been the sensitive one, the child who absorbed everyone else's emotions and carried them like weights on his small shoulders. He'd been 8 years old when William's mother died, and he'd spent weeks following me around the house, afraid that if he let me out of his sight, I might disappear too. We called the children together that evening, sat them down in our living room, and I told them everything I could about what I'd learned. I explained that James had made a terrible choice, that he'd been young and scared and had handled his fears in the worst possible way, but that it didn't change anything about our family now. "David," I said, looking at my 16-year-old son, who looked so much like the man who'd abandoned him. "Your birth father made mistakes that hurt a lot of people, but that doesn't reflect on you. You're not responsible for his choices, and those choices don't define who you are or what you can become." "But everything you told me about him was a lie," David said, his voice thick with pain and confusion. "All those stories about him working, so hard to provide for us, about him dying because he loved us so much he wouldn't quit working extra shifts. None of it was true." "The love was true," I said. "James did love us in his own limited way. But he wasn't strong enough to handle that love, wasn't mature enough to let it make him a better man instead of running from the responsibility it represented." Sarah, 13 and trying to understand how adults could make such devastating mistakes, asked, "Are you going to divorce Dad now? Are you going to go back to James?" "Absolutely not," I said firmly. "William is my husband, the father who chose to stay, the man who built this life with me. James is part of our past, but William is our present and our future." Michael, quiet and thoughtful, asked the question that surprised me most. "Mom, are you sorry you married Dad? If James hadn't left, would you have been happier?" I looked at William, this steady man who'd saved my life and David's life, who'd given me Sarah and Michael, who'd loved me through 17 years of marriage with patience and kindness and unwavering commitment. "Michael," I said, "if James hadn't left, I never would have met your father. You and Sarah wouldn't exist. David wouldn't have had the stable home that helped him become the wonderful young man he is. Sometimes terrible things happen that lead to beautiful outcomes we never could have imagined. We spent hours that night talking, crying, trying to rebuild our family's understanding of its own history. David asked if he could meet James, and I told him he'd have to wait until he was 18, until he was old enough to handle that relationship without it destroying everything William had built with him. But I want you to understand something. I told David, William adopted you when you were barely walking. He taught you to ride a bike, helped you with homework, came to every baseball game, worried about you when you were sick, celebrated every achievement. James may have provided the genetic material, but William is your father in every way that matters. David cried that night, mourning the heroic father figure I'd created in my stories, grieving the man he'd thought he was supposed to become. But over the following weeks, I watched him grow closer to William, saw him begin to appreciate the steady, reliable love that had shaped his entire life. The healing wasn't quick or easy. Sarah had nightmares for months, worried that if one parent could abandon his family, maybe others could too. Michael became extra clingy, needing constant reassurance that our family was solid, that William wasn't going to disappear the way James had. But gradually, we found our balance again. William never tried to make me stop talking about James when the children had questions, never showed jealousy when I had to explain parts of our family history that included my first husband. He just provided the same steady presence he'd always provided, letting us all heal at our own pace. James kept his promise. He didn't try to contact David, didn't send letters or birthday cards, didn't attempt to insert himself into our lives. Occasionally, I'd wonder what he was doing in Chicago, how his other children were growing up, whether he'd learned to be a better father to them than he'd been to David. But mostly, I stopped thinking about him at all. David graduated from high school with honors, went to the University of Illinois to study engineering just as he'd always planned. He came home for weekends sometimes, and he'd sit in the kitchen with William, asking questions about business, about marriage, about how to know when you're ready to take on adult responsibilities. "Dad," he said one evening during his sophomore year, "how did you know you were ready to adopt me? Weren't you scared about taking on someone else's child?" William looked at this young man he'd raised from a toddler, this son who shared none of his DNA but all of his values. "I was terrified," he admitted. "But your mother needed help, you needed a father, and I needed a family. Sometimes the best decisions are the ones that scare us most." "Do you ever regret it? Do you ever wish you'd found someone without complications, without a child from a previous marriage?" "Never," William said firmly. "You and your mother and Sarah and Michael are the best things that ever happened to me. I can't imagine my life without any of you." That conversation, David told me later, was when he finally understood the difference between the man who'd created him and the man who'd raised him. One had run from responsibility. The other had embraced it. One had chosen the easy path. The other had chosen love. Life continued. David graduated from college, got a job as a civil engineer, married a wonderful girl named Linda, who loved him for his steady character and gentle heart. They had 3 children: William James, named after the grandfather who'd raised him, not the father who'd abandoned him; Sarah Rose, named after his sister and me; and Catherine Marie, named after William's first wife, the woman who'd died bringing Emma into the world. Sarah became a teacher, just as she'd always dreamed. She married a kind man named Robert Chen, and they had twin daughters who became the lights of all our lives. Sarah taught elementary school and had a special gift for reaching children who came from broken homes, children who needed someone to believe in them when their own families had failed them. Michael followed William into banking, but he specialized in small business loans, helping families like ours get started, helping young couples buy their first homes. He married his college sweetheart, Jennifer, and they adopted 2 children who needed homes, a brother and sister whose parents had died in a car accident. Children who reminded me of myself at 22, suddenly alone and trying to figure out how to survive. Emma, William's daughter who'd become mine the day we married, grew up to be a social worker. She spent her career helping women in situations like the one I'd faced after James's supposed death. Single mothers trying to raise children alone. Women who needed someone to believe they were strong enough to rebuild their lives from whatever ruins they'd inherited. William and I grew old together gracefully. We celebrated our 25th wedding anniversary in 1985, our 30th in 1990, our 40th in 2000. Every year, I became more grateful for the man who'd chosen to stay when staying was hard, who'd shown me that real love isn't just about passion and chemistry. It's about commitment, about choosing the same person every day, even when life gets complicated. We traveled a little after William retired from the bank. Nothing fancy, just trips to see the grandchildren, vacations to Wisconsin lakes where William could fish and I could read on the shore, occasionally a drive to Chicago to visit museums or see a show. I never looked for James during those Chicago trips. I never drove past his auto shop or tried to catch a glimpse of the life he'd built with Patricia Henley. That chapter of my life was closed, and I had no desire to reopen it. William died of a heart attack on October 3, 1995, exactly 35 years and 18 days after our wedding. He was 72 years old, still working part-time at the bank, still helping young families get started, still the most decent man I'd ever known. I held his hand as he died in the hospital, surrounded by our children and grandchildren. His last words were, "Take care of each other. Family is everything." Losing William was different from losing James. When James disappeared, I'd been young and alone and terrified about how to survive. When William died, I was surrounded by the family we'd built together, supported by decades of love and commitment, and shared memories that no one could take away from me. The grief was deep, but clean. I was losing someone who'd lived a full life, who'd kept his promises, who'd loved me faithfully for 35 years. There was sadness but no betrayal, loss but no regret, pain but no anger. David gave the eulogy at William's funeral. Standing. At the podium in Springfield Methodist Church, looking out at a congregation filled with people whose lives William had touched, my son spoke about the man who'd chosen to be his father. "William Morrison taught me that being a father isn't about biology," David said. "It's about showing up every day, about being present for the moments that matter, about demonstrating through your actions what it means to be a man of integrity and commitment. He taught me that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make over and over again, especially when making that choice is difficult." I thought James should have been there to hear that, to understand what he'd given up when he'd chosen fear over love. But James belonged to my past, and this moment belonged to the family William and I had created together. I lived alone in our house on Maple Street for 10 more years after William's death. The children wanted me to move closer to one of them, to sell the house and downsize to something more manageable for a widow in her 80s. But that house held 40 years of memories I wasn't ready to abandon. Birthday parties in the backyard, Christmas mornings around the tree in the living room, quiet evenings on the front porch swing where William and I had planned our lives together. David would stop by twice a week to check on me, to fix whatever needed fixing, to sit in the kitchen and drink coffee while I told him stories about his children when they were babies. Sarah called every day just to hear my voice and make sure I was taking care of myself. Michael handled my finances, made sure my bills were paid and my doctor appointments were scheduled, worried about me with the same gentle concern he'd shown as a child. Emma, now in her 50s with grown children of her own, would take me grocery shopping every Saturday, patiently listening while I compared prices and complained about how expensive everything had gotten. She'd grown up to be so much like William, steady, practical, endlessly patient with the people she loved. I was content in those years after William's death, Not happy in the wild, passionate way I'd been happy with James, but deeply, peacefully content in a way that comes from a life well lived, from knowing you've raised children who became good adults, from understanding that the love you've shared has created something lasting and beautiful. I thought I knew the complete story of my life. I thought James Patterson was a closed chapter, a young man's mistake that had led to unexpected blessings, a betrayal that had ultimately taught me the difference between infatuation and real love. I was wrong about that too. Last Monday morning, March 20th, 2023, I received a package in the mail. The return address was Chicago, Illinois, with a name I didn't recognize, Patricia Henry. It took me a moment to remember that Patricia Henley had become Patricia Henry when she married James under his assumed name. Inside the package was a handwritten letter and a small wooden box that looked like it had been crafted with care and considerable skill. My hands shook as I opened the letter, though I couldn't have said whether it was from age, emotion, or some premonition that my understanding of the past was about to be shattered once again. "Dear Mrs. Morrison," the letter began. "My name is Patricia Henry. You knew me as Patricia Henley many years ago, though we never met. I was married to James Henry, the man you knew as James Patterson, for 58 years until his death 3 months ago. James made me promise that if I outlived him, I would send you the contents of this box and tell you the truth about what really happened in 1958. He said you deserved to know the whole story, even if it came too late to change anything. I'm 89 years old now, and I don't have much time left myself. But I can't die knowing that you've lived your entire life believing a lie that was meant to protect you, but probably caused you more pain than the truth ever could have. What I'm about to tell you will be difficult to accept, but I have documents, photographs, and other evidence to support every word. James wasn't the man you think he was, and what happened in December 1958 wasn't what anyone told you. Please sit down before you read the rest of this letter." I was already sitting at my kitchen table, the same table where Detective Sullivan had told me James was alive, the same table where I'd planned thousands of meals and helped children, with homework and grown old with William. But I gripped the edges of that familiar table as I read Patricia's next words. "Mrs. Morrison, James Patterson didn't abandon you and your unborn child in December 1958. He was murdered." The letter fell from my hands. Murdered. James hadn't left me, hadn't chosen another woman over me, hadn't decided to start fresh without the burden of a wife and child. He'd been killed, but that made no sense. Detective Sullivan had shown me evidence, documents proving James was alive in Chicago. I'd met with him myself in 1975, had sat across from him in Murphy's restaurant and listened to him confess to abandoning me. With shaking hands, I picked up the letter and continued reading. "The man you met in 1975, the man who called himself James Patterson and confessed to leaving you, was my first husband, Robert Henley. Robert was James's cousin, looked enough like him to pass for him, especially after 18 years when people's memories of details fade. Here's what really happened. James was murdered on December 4th, 1958, 3 days before the plant explosion. He'd discovered that Robert and several other men were planning to fake their deaths, collect insurance money, and disappear. James threatened to report them to the police. Robert killed him to keep him quiet. Robert took James's identity, married me under James's name, and lived as James Patterson for the rest of his life. When Detective Sullivan tracked us down in 1975, Robert knew the only way to avoid murder charges was to confess to the lesser crime of abandonment and fraud. He convinced me to go along with the story, told me it was the only way to keep our children from learning their father was a murderer. I've lived with this secret for 48 years, Mrs. Morrison. I've watched Robert struggle with guilt over what he did to you, what he did to James, what he did to your son David. Robert loved James like a brother, but he was desperate and scared. And when James threatened to expose the insurance scam, Robert made a choice that haunted him for the rest of his life. I'm telling you this now because James, your real James, deserves to have his name cleared. He didn't abandon you. He died trying to do the right thing, trying to stop a criminal conspiracy. He died loving you and your unborn child, never knowing he had a son who would grow up believing his father had abandoned him. In the box, you'll find James's watch, the one his grandfather gave him. Robert took it from James's body before disposing of it. You'll also find a letter James was writing to you the night he died, a letter Robert found in James's pocket and kept all these years as evidence of his crime. Robert confessed everything to me on his deathbed, made me promise to tell you the truth after he was gone. He said he couldn't face God without you knowing that James never stopped loving you, never chose to leave you, died protecting not just you but all the other wives who would have been victimized by the insurance fraud if he hadn't tried to stop it. I know this letter will turn your world upside down again, just as Detective Sullivan's visit did in 1975. But you deserve to know that the man you loved was exactly who you thought he was. Good, loyal, brave enough to risk his life to protect innocent people. Your son David deserves to know that his father died a hero, not a coward. Your husband William deserved to know he was raising the son of a man who died trying to do the right thing. I'm sorry I waited so long to tell you this. I'm sorry you've spent 65 years believing a lie that was supposed to protect you, but probably broke your heart instead. James loved you more than life itself. He proved that by dying, rather than let criminals destroy other families the way they ultimately destroyed yours. With deep regret and sincere sympathy, Patricia Henry. I sat at my kitchen table for 3 hours, staring at that letter, trying to process what it meant. James hadn't abandoned me. He'd been murdered for trying to protect me and other innocent families from the insurance fraud conspiracy. The man I'd met in 1975, the man who'd confessed to leaving me for another woman, had been Robert Henley, James's cousin and killer. He'd spent 17 years living as James, raising children under my husband's name, carrying the guilt of both murder and the destruction of our family. With trembling hands, I opened the wooden box Patricia had sent. Inside was James's watch, the gold pocket watch his grandfather had given him on his 18th birthday, the watch I'd planned to save for our son. There was also an envelope, yellowed with age, with, "For my beloved Ellie," written in James's familiar handwriting. I opened the letter with tears streaming down my face. "My darling Ellie," it began, and just seeing those words in his handwriting made me feel 22 years old again, madly in love with a man who'd called me his darling every single day of our marriage. I'm writing this on December 4th, 1958, because I don't know if I'll have another chance to tell you how much I love you and our baby. I've discovered something at the plant, something involving insurance fraud and fake deaths, and I'm going to the police tomorrow morning. Robert tried to convince me to join them, to fake my own death and start over somewhere else with the insurance money. He said it would be easy, that we could have a better life without the burden of responsibility, without the pressure of providing for families on factory wages. But Ellie, I could never abandon you and our baby. You are everything good in my life, everything worth working for, everything worth living for. The thought of our child growing up without a father, the thought of you struggling alone to raise him, makes me sick to my stomach. I told Robert I was going to report the whole conspiracy to the police. I told him I couldn't let them destroy other families the way they were planning to destroy ours and the families of the other men involved. He got angry, said I was being naive, said I'd regret interfering with their plans. I'm scared, Ellie. Not of the police, not of losing my job, but scared that Robert and his friends might try to stop me from doing the right thing. If something happens to me, if I don't come home tomorrow, I need you to know that I died loving you more than all the stars in the sky. Take care of our baby. Raise him to be better than his father, stronger than his father, brave enough to always choose what's right even when it's dangerous. Tell him his daddy loved him before he was born, that I dreamed about teaching him to play baseball and helping him with his homework and walking him down the aisle when he gets married someday. I'm sorry I couldn't give you the house with the white picket fence and the rose garden. I'm sorry I couldn't live long enough to see our son become a man. But I'm not sorry I married you. And I'm not sorry we created a life together. You made me happier in 11 months than I ever thought possible. If something happens to me, find someone who will love you the way you deserve to be loved. Find someone who will be a good father to our son. Don't spend your life mourning me, Ellie. Live. Be happy. Raise our boy to be proud of his name. I love you forever and always. Your devoted husband, James Patterson. P.S. The watch is for our son when he's old enough to appreciate it. Tell him it belonged to his great-grandfather, who was also a man who tried to do right even when it was hard. I collapsed at my kitchen table, sobbing for the man I'd lost. For the 65 years I'd spent believing he'd abandoned me. For the heroic father David had never gotten to meet. James had died trying to protect us. Died trying to stop criminals from destroying other families, and we'd never known. All those years of telling David his father had abandoned him. All those years of believing I'd been naive to trust someone who'd betrayed me completely. All those years of carrying the weight of abandonment when the truth was that James had I'd protecting me. And Robert Henley, the man I'd met in 1975, the man who'd confessed to leaving me, had been living with James's blood on his hands, raising children under the name of the man he'd murdered, carrying the guilt of destroying not just James, but our entire family. I called David immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely dial his number. "Mom?" he said, and I could hear the concern in his voice. "What's wrong? You sound upset." "David, I need you to come over right away. Bring Linda and the children if you can. I need to tell you something about your father, about James Patterson." "Mom, we've been through all of this. I don't need to hear any more about your father didn't abandon us," I interrupted, my voice breaking. "He was murdered, David. James Patterson was murdered trying to protect us." There was silence on the other end of the phone, then David's voice, quiet and shocked. "What are you talking about? Just come over. Bring Sarah and Michael if you can reach them. I have documents, evidence, a letter from your father that explains everything. Everything we believed was a lie, David. Your father was exactly the man I told you he was when you were little. He died a hero." Within 2 hours, my kitchen was full again. David and Linda, Sarah and Robert, Michael and Jennifer, all of them, gathering around the same table where I'd learned James was supposedly alive in 1975, where I'd tried to rebuild our understanding of our family history. I read them Patricia's letter, showed them James's final letter to me, let them pass around the pocket watch that should have been David's inheritance 65 years ago. "David," cried. My 64-year-old son sat at my kitchen table and wept for the father he'd finally gotten back, for the hero he'd thought he'd lost, for the decades of believing he came from abandonment instead of sacrifice. "All those times I wondered if I had his weakness in me," David said through his tears. "All those times I worried that if things got tough enough, I might run away like he did. But he didn't run away. He died standing up for what was right." Sarah was furious. How could they do this to us? How could they let us grow up believing Dad was a coward when he was actually murdered for being brave? Michael, always the practical one, was thinking about the legal implications. Is Robert Henley still alive? Can charges still be filed? There's no statute of limitations on murder. I showed them the rest of Patricia's letter, the part where she explained that Robert had died 3 months earlier, that she was 99 years old and dying herself, that she'd waited until after Robert's death to tell the truth, because she'd promised him she would protect their children from knowing their father was a murderer. "So there's no justice," Sarah said. "Robert Henley lived a full life under Dad's name while Dad moldered in some unmarked grave. The justice is this," I said, looking around at my children and grandchildren. "The justice is that we finally know the truth. That David finally knows his father died for love, not from lack of it. That James Patterson's name is cleared, that his sacrifice is finally acknowledged. We spent the evening looking through the rest of the documents Patricia had sent. Police reports from 1958 that mentioned James Patterson as a potential witness in the insurance fraud investigation. Hospital records showing that Robert Henley had been treated for injuries consistent with a fight on December 4, 1958. Injuries he'd claimed came from a bar brawl, but which were probably from his struggle with James. There were photographs of Robert Henley from the 1950s, and seeing them made me sick. He did look like James, enough to fool people who'd only known James casually, enough to convince Detective Sullivan in 1975 that he was meeting with the real James Patterson. But I should have known. Sitting in Murphy's restaurant, listening to that man confess to abandoning me, I should have known it wasn't my James. The man I'd married would never have been able to sit calmly across from me while describing how he'd chosen another woman over our unborn child. The real James would have been devastated by the pain he'd caused, would have been broken by the knowledge that I'd suffered alone for 17 years because of his supposed betrayal. Robert Henley had been calm because he was acting, playing a role, confessing to crimes he hadn't committed to hide the much worse crime he had committed. "Mom," David said as the evening grew late, "what happens now? How do we process this?" "We honor your father's memory properly," I said. "We tell his story the way it should have been told from the beginning. We make sure your children know their grandfather died a hero." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity. David contacted Detective Sullivan, who was retired but still living in Springfield. At 87 years old, Sullivan remembered the Patterson case clearly and was devastated to learn he'd been deceived by Robert Henley. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Morrison," he said when he came to my house to review Patricia's evidence. "I thought I was giving you closure, helping you understand what had happened. Instead, I was perpetuating a lie that caused you and your family decades of unnecessary pain." "You couldn't have known," I told him. Robert Henley had been living as James for 17 years by then. He had the documentation, the history, enough resemblance to fool anyone who didn't know James intimately. Detective Sullivan helped us contact the Chicago Police Department, though there wasn't much they could do since Robert Henley was dead and Patricia Henry was too frail to prosecute. But they did confirm that Robert had died under James's assumed name, that he'd lived his entire adult life using my husband's identity. The hardest part was contacting Robert and Patricia's children, the three people who'd grown up believing Robert Henley was their father, who'd lived their entire lives under the Patterson name without knowing their father had murdered the real James Patterson. David insisted on making those calls himself. "They deserve to know," he said. "They've been living with a lie just like we were, except their lie was protecting a murderer instead of honoring a hero." The conversations were devastating. Robert and Patricia's eldest son, James Robert Henry, he'd been named after the man his father had murdered, was 64 years old, married with children and grandchildren, a respected member of his community, who'd built his entire identity around being the son of James Patterson. "My father talked about you and David constantly," James Robert told us during a painful phone call. "He was eaten up with guilt about abandoning you, about not being there for David's childhood. He used to cry when he was drunk, talking about the son he'd left behind, wondering what kind of man David had become. That guilt, I realized, hadn't been about abandoning us. It had been about murdering David's real father, about stealing not just James's life, but David's chance to know the man who died protecting us." We arranged to meet Robert and Patricia's children in Chicago. It seemed important to look them in the eye when we told them the complete truth, to help them understand that they weren't responsible for their father's crimes, just as David wasn't responsible for the sins he'd thought his father had committed. The meeting was surreal. Sitting in a restaurant in Chicago, looking at people who'd grown up believing they were James Patterson's children, who carried his name without any right to it, who'd inherited the guilt of crimes they'd never committed. "I don't know how to process this," said Patricia Marie Henry, Robert and Patricia's daughter. "My entire life, I've been Patricia Marie Patterson. My children have Patterson as their middle name. We've been living under the identity of a man our father murdered. Your father loved you, I told her gently. Whatever else Robert Henley did, he raised 3 children who seem like good, decent people. That counts for something. But we're not Pattersons, said their youngest son, Michael David Henry. We have no right to this name, no right to claim connection to a man we never met, a man our father killed. David surprised me by disagreeing. You've been Pattersons your whole lives, he said. You've honored that name, lived good lives under it. I'm not going to ask you to change your identities because of something your father did 65 years ago. We spent 3 days in Chicago, sorting through the complex emotions of 2 families whose histories had been intertwined by murder and deception. Robert and Patricia's children were devastated to learn their father was a killer, but they were also relieved to understand why he'd carried such crushing guilt for so many years. They showed us photographs of Robert in his later years, an old man who'd built a successful auto repair business, who'd been a pillar of his church community, who'd apparently spent the last decades of his life trying to atone for the terrible thing he'd done as a young man. He donated thousands of dollars to charities for single mothers, James Robert told us. Every Christmas, he'd sponsor 10 families, make sure they had food and presents for their children. He said it was penance for something he'd done when he was young. It was penance for destroying our family, for leaving me to raise David alone. While he built a new life using James's name and identity, but even knowing the truth about Robert's guilt and attempted atonement, I couldn't forgive him. He'd lived a full life while James rotted in whatever unmarked grave Robert had put him in. He'd raised children and saw grandchildren born while David grew up fatherless, believing he came from abandonment instead of sacrifice. Most unforgivably, Robert had let me spend 65 years believing the man I'd loved more than life itself had betrayed me, had chosen another woman over me, had abandoned our unborn child. He'd let me carry that weight, that shame, that carefully buried anger, when the truth was that James had died protecting me. We never found James's body. Patricia Henry died 2 weeks after our meeting in Chicago, taking with her the secret of where Robert had disposed of my husband's remains. We searched through Robert's papers, his personal effects, looking for some clue about where James might be buried, but found nothing. I'm sorry, James Robert Henry told us when we asked if his father had ever mentioned where James was buried. Dad never talked about the details. He just said James was at peace, that he'd been given a proper burial, but he never said where. So, we held a memorial service instead, 65 years after James's actual death. David arranged it all, sent invitations to anyone who'd known James in 1958, anyone who was still alive to remember the man he'd actually been. The service was held at Springfield Methodist Church, the same church where James and I had been married, where we'd planned to baptize our children, where I'd later married William and raised the family James had died protecting. Robert Patterson, James's brother, was 87 years old, but made the trip from Florida where he'd retired. Margaret, his wife, came with him, along with their children and grandchildren, David's cousins who'd grown up believing their uncle had abandoned his family. I always wondered, Robert told me before the service began. James loved you so much, talked about you and the baby constantly. It never made sense that he'd just disappear. But when we got word that he'd been killed in the plant explosion, when we saw the death certificate and the closed casket, you saw what Robert Henley wanted you to see, I said. He planned it all very carefully, made sure everyone would believe James died in that explosion while he stole James's identity and started over. The church was full. Friends from the Ford plant, neighbors who'd known us as a young married couple, people who'd wondered for 65 years what had really happened to James Patterson. David stood at the podium where William's eulogy had been delivered 28 years earlier, and he told the congregation about the father he'd finally gotten to meet. My father, James Patterson, died on December 4th, 1958, David said, his voice strong and clear, He was murdered for trying to stop a criminal conspiracy, for refusing to abandon his pregnant wife and unborn child, for choosing to do what was right even when it put his life in danger. For 65 years, my family believed James had abandoned us. We lived with the shame of that abandonment, the pain of thinking we hadn't been worth staying for. Today, we're here to set the record straight, to honor a man who died protecting not just us, but other innocent families who would have been victimized by the insurance fraud he tried to stop. James Patterson was 22 years old when he died. He was looking forward to becoming a father, to building a life with the woman he loved, to providing for his family through honest work and commitment. He died before he got to hold his son, before he got to teach him to play baseball, before he got to see him graduate from high school and college and become a man. But even though James never got to raise me, his values did. The stories my mother told me about his character, his commitment, his love for our family, those stories shaped me into the man I became. Even when I thought he'd abandoned us, even when I struggled with the idea that I might have inherited his supposed weakness, the example of the man my mother described helped me choose commitment over abandonment, responsibility over selfishness. James Patterson was murdered, but his legacy lived on. He raised me from the grave through the stories of his character, the example of his love, the proof that some people will die rather than betray the people they've promised to protect. Today, we're not just mourning his death. We're celebrating his life, his sacrifice, his ultimate victory over the man who tried to destroy his legacy by stealing his name and living his life. Rest in peace, Dad. You died a hero, and your son is proud to carry your name. I spoke too, standing at that podium with James's pocket watch in my hands, telling the congregation about the man I'd loved for 11 months and mourned for 65 years. James Patterson was the love of my life, I said, looking out at faces that remembered the young couple we'd been. But more than that, he was the foundation of my life. Even when I believed he'd betrayed me, even when I thought he'd chosen another woman over our family, the love we'd shared taught me what real commitment looked like. When I married William Morrison 2 years after James's supposed death, I knew what to look for in a husband because James had shown me what true love was supposed to feel like. When I raised our children, I taught them about character and commitment because James had demonstrated those qualities in the short time we had together. The 11 months I spent as James Patterson's wife were the most formative months of my life. They taught me how to love completely, how to trust deeply, and eventually, when I thought he'd broken that trust, how to forgive and rebuild. Learning the truth about James's death doesn't just clear his name. It validates every instinct I had about his character, every story I told our son about the kind of man his father was, every moment of love we shared that I'd held sacred even when I thought he'd thrown it all away for someone else. James Patterson died protecting love. Not just our love, but the love of every family that would have been destroyed by the criminal conspiracy he died trying to stop. That's the kind of man he was. That's the legacy he left his son. After the service, people came up to share their memories of James. Co-workers who remembered him as honest and hardworking. Neighbors who recalled how devoted he'd been to his pregnant wife. Friends who'd never believed he would willingly abandon his family. I knew something wasn't right, said Tom Wilson, who'd worked beside James at the Ford plant. James was so excited about that baby, talked about you constantly. The day before the explosion, he was worried about something. Said he might have to do something that could get him in trouble, but that it was the right thing to do. I always wondered what he meant. Now we knew. James had been preparing to report the insurance fraud conspiracy, knowing it might cost him his job, but determined to protect innocent families from being victimized. I'm 87 years old now, and I've finally learned the complete truth about the great love of my life. James Patterson didn't abandon me. He died protecting me. He didn't choose another woman over our family. He chose death over betraying us. David has embraced his father's memory with a passion that's both beautiful and heartbreaking to watch. At 64, he's discovered that he doesn't carry the genes of abandonment. He carries the legacy of sacrifice. He's started a scholarship fund at the University of Illinois for children of single mothers, honoring both the father who died protecting him and the stepfather who raised him with love and commitment. Sarah and Michael have struggled more with the revelation. They're grateful to know the truth, grateful that their brother finally understands his father died a hero, but they're also angry about the decades of unnecessary pain our family endured because of Robert Henley's deception. How? Do we forgive someone who's already dead? Sarah asked me recently. How do we process anger toward a man we can't confront, can't demand answers from, can't make pay for what he did to our family? We forgive him the same way I forgave James when I thought he'd abandoned us, I told her. Not because he deserves it, but because carrying anger for someone who's dead only poisons the living. It's taken me months to process this final revelation, to reorganize 65 years of carefully constructed memories and emotions. Some days I'm grateful to finally know the truth. Other days I'm furious that I spent my entire adult life believing a lie that robbed me of the comfort I should have found in James's memory. But mostly, I'm at peace. James Patterson was exactly who I thought he was when I fell in love with him at 19. He was the man I believed him to be during our 11 perfect months of marriage. He was the hero I described to David in all those bedtime stories, the man of character and commitment I held up as an example even when I thought he'd ultimately failed us. My instincts about love, about character, about the kind of man worth building a life with, they were all correct. I wasn't naive to trust James so completely. I wasn't foolish to believe in love at first sight. I wasn't wrong to think I'd found someone who would move heaven and earth to protect our family. James proved all of that by dying for it. And William Morrison, the man who saved us and raised David and gave me 43 years of steady love, was exactly the kind of man James would have chosen to care for us if he'd had the chance to choose. William embodied the same values James had died for: commitment, loyalty, the understanding that real love means staying when staying is hard. I've spent my entire adult life being loved by two extraordinary men, one who died protecting me and one who lived protecting me. That's a blessing most people never receive once, let alone twice. Yesterday, David brought his grandson, my great-grandson William James Patterson Morrison, to visit me. Little William is 7 years old, the same age David was when I married William, and our family began to heal from what we thought was James's abandonment. "Great-grandma," little William asked as he sat at my kitchen table coloring pictures, "tell me about my great-great-grandfather James. Mom says he was a hero who died saving people." And so I told him the story, the real story this time, about a young man who loved his pregnant wife so much that he died rather than let criminals hurt other families, about a father who never got to hold his son, but who left him the most precious inheritance of all. The example of a man who chose courage over cowardice, love over selfishness, death over betrayal. Little William listened with the serious attention children give to stories about superheroes, which is exactly what James Patterson was, a real-life hero who died protecting innocent people from criminals who would have destroyed their lives. "Will I be brave like great-great-grandfather James?" little William asked. "You already are," I told him. "Bravery isn't something you inherit in your genes. It's something you choose, every time you pick right over wrong, every time you stand up for someone who needs protecting, every time you keep a promise even when keeping it is hard." That's what I want people to understand from this story, dear ones. That's why I'm sharing it now, at 87 years old. Even though the telling has reopened wounds I thought had healed decades ago, love doesn't always get the ending it deserves. Sometimes the people we love most are taken from us by violence, by circumstance, by the evil choices other people make. Sometimes we live for years believing lies about the people we've lost, carrying guilt and anger that belongs to someone else entirely. But the love itself, that's real. that's permanent, that survives death, survives lies, survives even the people who tried to destroy it. James Patterson loved me completely for 11 months, and that love shaped the rest of my life. It taught me what to look for in William Morrison. It helped me raise children who understood the difference between commitment and abandonment. It gave me the strength to forgive betrayal, the wisdom to recognize genuine devotion, and the faith to believe that love is always worth the risk, even when loving someone costs everything. William Morrison loved me steadily for 43 years, and that love completed what James had started. It showed me that passion without commitment is just infatuation, but commitment with genuine affection is the foundation of everything beautiful in this world. I was blessed to have both kinds of love in my life. I was blessed to learn that heroes really do exist. They're just usually quiet people making brave choices in ordinary circumstances, people like James who die protecting others, and people like William who live protecting others. If you're listening to this story and you're carrying your own secret pain, your own betrayal, your own broken heart, I want you to know something. You are stronger than you realize. You can survive more than you think. And sometimes the life you build from the ashes of your shattered dreams turns out to be even more beautiful than the one that was taken from you. David named his eldest son William James, honoring both the grandfather who raised him and the father who died protecting him. That tells you everything you need to know about which kinds of love really matter, which kinds of commitment really count, which kinds of men really deserve to be called fathers. The secret that I thought destroyed 3 lives actually revealed the truth that saved them. James Patterson didn't abandon us. He died for us. William Morrison didn't just rescue us, he completed us. And our family wasn't broken by betrayal. It was strengthened by learning the difference between love that runs and love that stays. That's my gift to you, my testimony about the power of love to survive anything the world can throw at it. The love never died. It just had to wait 65 years to tell its true story. Remember, dear ones, you are stronger than your secrets, more resilient than your pain, and worthy of the kind of love that would die to protect you and live to cherish you. Don't settle for less. Don't accept abandonment as love. Don't let anyone's inability to commit make you question your worth. You deserve the kind of love that chooses you every day, not just when it's easy, but especially when it's hard. You deserve someone who sees forever with you as a promise to keep, not a burden to escape. You deserve the truth, even when the truth comes 65 years too late. My name is Eleanor Rose Patterson Morrison, and this is my true story. James Patterson was murdered protecting the people he loved. William Morrison lived protecting the people he loved. And I was blessed beyond measure to be loved by both of them. The cross I carried became the strength that saved me. The lie I believed became the truth that freed me. And the secret I kept became the story that might help you understand that love, real love, is always worth fighting for, always worth waiting for, and always, always stronger than the people who try to destroy it. Now, I want to hear from you. How far into this story did you make it? What part touched your heart most deeply? Have you ever discovered that something you believed your entire life was a lie? How did you find the strength to rebuild your understanding of your own history? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Tell me where you're listening from. Are you at home, at work, taking a walk, lying in bed unable to sleep because your own secrets are keeping you awake? Sometimes sharing our stories helps others carry theirs. And if you know someone who needs to hear this story, someone who's been betrayed or abandoned or is carrying the weight of believing they weren't worth staying for, please share it with them. Sometimes we need to hear about other people's survival to believe in our own strength. Thank you for listening to my story, for letting an old woman share the burden and the blessing of a truth that took 8 decades to fully understand. You've given me the gift of finally, completely, telling the story of the love that defined my life. Not just one love, but 2. Both of them real. both of them precious, both of them proof that the human heart is capable of miracles.